The familiar sting of my mother's disapproval had become as predictable as the overcooked turkey she served every Thanksgiving. At 29, I'd learned to navigate these family gatherings with the same strategic patience I used in boardrooms, though my family had no idea about the latter. "Sarah's always been a dreamer," Mom announced to the assembled relatives, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for discussing my perceived failures. "Still playing dress-up in those expensive suits, pretending she's some big shot." She gestured dismissively at my tailored Armani blazer. "When really she's just counting other people's money at that little community bank." Uncle Robert chuckled, cutting into his turkey with theatrical precision. "Nothing wrong with honest work, Margaret. Not everyone can be a real executive like David here." He nodded toward my golden child brother, who preened at the attention while adjusting his department store tie. My younger sister Emma smirked from across the table. "Remember when she used to play business lady with Mom's old briefcase? Some things never change." The comment earned appreciative laughter from my cousins, who'd driven in from Connecticut specifically to witness the annual Sarah-shaming tradition. I sipped my wine calmly, watching the familiar dynamics play out. 25 years of family dinners had taught me exactly when to speak and when to remain silent. This was definitely a silence moment. "The suits are getting more expensive though," observed Aunt Linda, my father's sister who'd appointed herself the family's fashion police. "Where's a bank teller getting Armani money? Credit cards maxed out again." Dad leaned back in his chair, his disappointment radiating across the dining room like heat from the fireplace. "That's what worries me. Living beyond her means just like always. Sarah, you need to face facts. You're 29 years old. It's time to stop pretending and start accepting reality." "What reality is that, Dad?" I asked quietly, genuinely curious about his perspective. "You work at a community bank in Queens. You process deposits and cash checks. It's honest work, but it's not." He gestured vaguely at my attire. "This fantasy version of yourself that you keep insisting on presenting to the world." My brother David nodded sagely, as if he'd achieved some profound wisdom in his 32 years of middle management at an insurance company. "Dad's right. There's dignity in accepting who you are. Not everyone can be in high finance. The sooner you stop pretending, the happier you'll be." The irony wasn't lost on me. David's idea of high finance was processing claims for fender benders, but pointing that out would only escalate the situation. Instead, I smiled and took another bite of Mom's aggressively seasoned stuffing. "I mean, look at this apartment you're renting in Manhattan," Emma continued, pulling up photos on her phone. "The rent alone must be eating your entire paycheck. It's just not sustainable, Sarah. You can't keep living this lie." Cousin Michael, fresh from his sophomore year studying business at a state school, decided to offer his expertise. "My professor says people who live beyond their means usually have deeper psychological issues. It's about insecurity and the need for external validation." "Exactly," Mom jumped in, her voice gaining momentum like a freight train. "All this dressing up, the expensive apartment, that fancy car you lease. It's all compensation for feeling inadequate. Honey, there's nothing wrong with being ordinary." The funny thing was she wasn't entirely wrong about the compensation part. My lifestyle choices were indeed carefully calculated, just not for the reasons she imagined. Every suit, every address, every vehicle was selected to project a specific image to specific audiences. The fact that it also happened to irritate my family was simply an amusing side effect. Uncle Robert raised his wine glass with mock solemnity. "Here's to Sarah finally accepting that she's not destined for Wall Street. To finding contentment in Queens." The table erupted in supportive chuckles and raised glasses. Even my teenage nephew Jake, who usually avoided family drama, snickered behind his phone. "You know what I heard?" Aunt Linda leaned forward conspiratorially. "That community bank she works at is probably going to be bought out by one of the big chains. She'll be lucky to keep her teller position when that happens." My stomach tightened slightly. Not because of any job insecurity, Linda's gossip was characteristically inaccurate, but because the merger she'd referenced was actually under my direct oversight. The irony of the situation was almost too perfect. "Which bank is it again?" asked Cousin Patricia, who worked in retail but somehow always positioned herself as the family expert on everything financial. "First Community of Queens," Mom answered with a slight wince as if the name itself embarrassed her. "One of those tiny neighborhood places that's barely hanging on. They probably can't even afford proper security." David nodded knowingly. "Those small banks are dinosaurs. They'll all be gobbled up by Chase or Bank of America eventually. Sarah, you should really start looking for something more stable. Maybe customer service at a bigger company. I set down my fork carefully, maintaining the serene expression I'd perfected over years of hostile takeover negotiations. You think I should leave banking altogether? Honey, you're not really in banking, Mom corrected gently, her tone suggesting she was trying to spare my feelings. You work at a bank. There's a difference. Real banking happens on Wall Street with people who went to Ivy League schools and have actual finance degrees. Mom's right, Emma chimed in. You studied art history at a state school. It's not exactly Goldman Sachs material. The comment drew knowing nods from around the table. The Goldman Sachs reference almost made me smile. If Emma only knew how often I'd walked through those familiar glass doors on West Street, how many times I'd sat in conference rooms on the 43rd floor discussing billion-dollar deals while sipping coffee from cups bearing that distinctive logo. Speaking of Goldman, Uncle Robert interjected, did you see that article about their latest merger? Something like $8 billion. That's the kind of money we're talking about in real finance. Not counting 20s at a community bank window. Actually, it was $8.7 billion and I'd personally spent 6 months structuring the deal, but correcting Robert would require explanations I wasn't ready to provide. Instead, I nodded politely and reached for the cranberry sauce. The suits really are beautifully tailored though, admitted Cousin Patricia with grudging admiration. Where do you shop? I mean, before you have to start budgeting more realistically. Various places, I replied vaguely. The truth was that most of my professional wardrobe came from a personal shopper who understood the specific requirements of C-suite presentations and client dinners, but that level of detail would only fuel more speculation about my supposed financial irresponsibility. Dad cleared his throat, preparing for what I recognized as his traditional Thanksgiving lecture. Sarah, your mother and I have been talking. We're worried about your future. This fantasy lifestyle isn't sustainable. You need to start making practical decisions. What kind of decisions? I asked, genuinely curious about their recommendations. Move back to Queens permanently. Find a nice apartment you can actually afford. Maybe meet someone who works in a similar field, another bank employee or an accountant. Someone realistic about life expectations. The suggestion that I should date within my perceived socioeconomic bracket was particularly amusing, considering my last relationship had been with a federal judge who'd ultimately found my work schedule too demanding. But explaining that would require revealing details about why federal judges and I moved in the same professional circles. And stop wearing those expensive suits to a teller job, Mom added. It makes your coworkers uncomfortable. Dress appropriately for your position. Emma leaned forward with sudden excitement. Oh, speaking of positions, guess who got promoted to assistant manager at her marketing firm? She paused dramatically. Me. Starting salary is $48,000 plus benefits. The table erupted in congratulations and praise for Emma's achievement. I genuinely smiled, pleased to see my sister advancing in her career, even as the implicit comparison hung heavy in the air. Now that's realistic progress, Dad beamed. Working your way up through hard work and appropriate expectations. Sarah, you could learn something from your sister's approach. Uncle Robert raised his glass again. To Emma. Finally, an example of actual success in the family. As they toasted Emma's promotion, my phone began buzzing against my leg. I glanced discreetly at the screen and saw the distinctive caller ID that always sent a small jolt of adrenaline through my system, even after 3 years in this position. Excuse me, I said quietly, starting to rise from the table. Oh no, Mom's voice sharpened. Absolutely not. We're having a family dinner. Whatever customer service emergency you think you have can wait until tomorrow. Sarah always thinks her little bank job is so important, laughed Cousin Michael. Like someone desperately needs to deposit their grocery money right now. The phone continued its insistent buzzing. I could see the notification light blinking through my jacket pocket, and I knew from experience that when this particular number called during off hours, the conversation would not be optional. It might be important, I said calmly. More important than family? Dad's question carried the weight of 29 years of carefully orchestrated guilt. The buzzing stopped, then immediately started again. Same caller ID. Emma smirked. Let me guess, someone needs their account balance? Super urgent banking business. Before I could respond, the buzzing stopped again, replaced by the distinct chime of a text message. Then another. Then a third in rapid succession. Uncle Robert laughed. Probably spam calls. You know how those scammers target bank employees, figuring they're gullible about financial stuff. The phone started buzzing again. Fourth call in 2 minutes. I stood up slowly, my decision made. I really do need to take this. Sarah. Mom's voice carried that particular warning tone I remembered from childhood. Sit down. Stop being dramatic about your minimum wage job. My phone went silent for exactly 10 seconds, then erupted in the specific rapid-fire sequence that indicated an escalating emergency protocol. Even through the fabric of my jacket, the sound was unmistakably urgent. I apologize, I said, already moving toward the kitchen for privacy. But this really can't wait. The disapproving murmurs followed me as I stepped through the doorway, pulling out my phone and checking the caller ID one final time. Same number that had been trying to reach me. The number that belonged to the Goldman Sachs executive assistant who coordinated my schedule and managed my most sensitive communications. I swiped to answer just as the dining room conversation resumed behind me, now focused on my perceived rudeness and misplaced priorities. Director Williams, came the familiar voice of Janet, my assistant, her tone carrying the particular urgency reserved for genuine crises. I'm sorry to interrupt your holiday, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. What's the issue? I asked quietly, moving further into the kitchen to ensure privacy. The Meridian Castellano merger. The Italian Regulatory Board just announced they're accelerating their review timeline. They want final documentation by Monday morning Rome time, which means we need your approval on the restructured terms by tomorrow evening at the latest. I closed my eyes, running through the implications. The Meridian Castellano deal was an $8.7 billion pharmaceutical merger that had been 18 months in the making. As the lead managing director, my approval was required for any structural changes to the agreement. What kind of restructuring are we talking about? I asked. The Italians want the European distribution rights held by a subsidiary rather than the parent company. Legal says it's doable, but it changes the debt allocation by about $400 million. I need your sign-off before we can move forward. From the dining room, I could hear my family's conversation continuing, punctuated by occasional laughter at what I assumed were additional comments about my mysterious bank emergency. Are you able to access the documents from your current location? Janet asked. I can have the senior associates walk you through the changes via secure video conference. I glanced back toward the dining room, where my family was undoubtedly crafting new theories about my inflated sense of self-importance. Yes, I can review everything. Set up the call for 1 hour from now. Perfect. I'll conference in Marcus and Jennifer from the legal team, plus Alessandro from our Rome office to explain the regulatory requirements. Should I send the amended term sheets to your secure email? Yes, and Janet? Thank you for handling this efficiently. I know everyone would rather be with their families today. Of course, Director Williams. The team understands how critical this timeline is. I'll send the meeting link now. I ended the call and stood quietly in the kitchen for a moment, processing the shift from family dinner dynamics to merger crisis management. This kind of rapid mental gear changing had become second nature over the years, but the contrast was still jarring. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation paused as everyone turned to look at me expectantly. Everything okay? Dad asked with exaggerated concern. Nobody's checkbook balance causing a national emergency, I hope? The comment earned chuckles from my cousins. I smiled and retook my seat. Just work stuff. Nothing that can't be handled. See? Mom said triumphantly. It's never actually an emergency. Sarah just likes feeling important. Emma leaned forward with mock seriousness. Let me guess. Someone needed to know if their direct deposit went through? Code red banking situation. Something like that, I replied, taking a sip of wine. Uncle Robert shook his head with amusement. You know, Sarah, most people in customer service jobs understand that work stays at work. Professional boundaries are important. The irony of receiving a lecture on professional boundaries from someone who sold used cars was not lost on me, but I simply nodded agreeably. I just think it's disrespectful to the family, Dad continued. We get together 4 times a year and you can't put away your phone for 2 hours? What kind of workplace emergency could possibly require a bank teller's immediate attention? Before I could respond, my phone began buzzing again. Different caller ID this time. Marcus from legal, probably wanting to brief me before the full team conference. The table went silent, all eyes focused on my pocket. Seriously? Emma's voice dripped with disbelief. Again. I glanced at the caller ID. Marcus wouldn't call unless Janet had specifically requested a preliminary briefing, which meant the legal complications were more complex than initially described. I began. No, Dad's voice was firm. Absolutely not. I don't care if the bank is being robbed. Dinner first, pretend job second. The phone continued buzzing insistently. Mom reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Honey, listen to me. This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes people think you're unstable. Normal employees don't get urgent calls during Thanksgiving dinner. You're not the CEO of Goldman Sachs. The phone went silent. Maybe her manager's calling, suggested cousin Patricia. To fire her for being unreliable? That's not funny, Mom scolded, though her tone suggested she found it a little funny. Sarah's had that job for 3 years. They're not going to fire her for being dedicated. Dedicated to a fault, Uncle Robert observed. There's a difference between work ethic and delusions of grandeur. My phone buzzed once with a text message. I could see part of the preview notification. Director Williams, the Italian regulatory. The message was cut off, but I could guess the content. More complications with the timeline, more variables requiring immediate attention. What does it say? Asked Jake, my nephew, leaning over with teenage curiosity. Nothing important, I replied, turning the phone face down on the table. Probably a Black Friday sale alert, Emma suggested. You know Sarah and her shopping addiction. The conversation drifted back to other topics. Emma's promotion, David's upcoming vacation, Mom's bridge club drama, while I mentally calculated timelines. If the Italian regulators were accelerating their review, the ripple effects would extend beyond just our documentation. The entire closing schedule would need adjustment, which meant coordinating with legal teams in 3 countries. My phone buzzed again. Another text, probably from Janet with the secure meeting link. This time I didn't even glance at it, but Emma noticed the notification light. Seriously, Sarah. Turn it off. Whatever crisis you think you're managing can wait until tomorrow. It's probably not even work, laughed cousin Michael. Maybe she signed up for emergency banking newsletters or something. Breaking news. Interest rates unchanged. The table found this hilarious. Even Dad cracked a smile. You know what I think? Aunt Linda set down her wine glass with authority. I think Sarah's phone is set to get notifications from some financial news app, and she's pretending they're work calls to seem important. That would actually make sense, David nodded thoughtfully. Remember how she used to pretend her college professors were calling her for advice? I never did that, I said mildly. You absolutely did, Emma jumped in. Senior year, you told everyone your art history professor wanted your opinion on some museum acquisition. Because he did. Sarah, no college professor needs a student's opinion on professional museum business, Mom explained patiently. Just like no bank needs a teller's opinion on major financial decisions. My phone buzzed again. Longer this time, definitely a call, not a text. The entire table stared at me expectantly. Answer it, Dad said suddenly. Go ahead. Show us this incredibly important bank emergency that can't wait until tomorrow. His tone suggested he was calling what he perceived as my bluff. The family leaned forward slightly, anticipating the reveal of whatever mundane customer service issue had been interrupting their dinner. I looked at the caller ID. Janet again, which meant the situation had probably escalated further. Okay, I said calmly, swiping to answer and putting the phone on speaker. Hello. Director Williams? Janet's voice filled the dining room, clear and professional. I apologize for the continued interruptions, but the Meridian Castellano situation has become more complex. The Italian Regulatory Board is requiring additional documentation that will impact the debt restructuring we discussed. The table went completely silent. I could hear the faint sound of my father's breathing. What kind of additional documentation? I asked, my voice shifting unconsciously into the tone I used for high-stakes negotiations. They want detailed projections for the European distribution subsidiary, including 3-year revenue forecasts and risk assessments. Legal says it's going to require input from both the London and Rome offices. I have Marcus standing by to walk you through the changes, and Alessandro is available for the regulatory requirements. I could feel my family's eyes on me, but I focused on the call. What's our timeline for submission? Monday morning Rome time, which gives us about 60 hours including the weekend. I know it's not ideal timing, but the client is adamant about maintaining the closing schedule. Understood. Set up the full team conference for. I glanced at my watch. 2 hours from now. I'll need the amended term sheets, the regulatory filing requirements, and a briefing document on the Italian board's concerns. Already prepared and sent to your secure email. I'll send the conference link within the next 10 minutes. Perfect. And Janet? Make sure the London team understands this is priority one. Whatever resources we need to pull this together. Of course, Director Williams. I'll coordinate with all offices and have everyone standing by. Thank you. I'll review the documents and join the call at the scheduled time. I ended the call and set the phone down on the table. The dining room remained completely silent for what felt like several minutes but was probably only 30 seconds. Finally, Uncle Robert cleared his throat. Did she just call you Director Williams? I nodded calmly, taking a sip of wine. Director of what? Asked Emma, her voice smaller than usual. Managing Director, I replied. Investment Banking Division. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. Investment banking? Goldman Sachs, I confirmed. The silence returned, heavier this time. Mom was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Goldman Sachs has managing directors? Several, I answered. I oversee mergers and acquisitions for pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies. Cousin Patricia's mouth was slightly open. Mergers and acquisitions? Corporate finance transactions. Companies buying other companies, essentially. The deal we were just discussing is worth about $8.7 billion. David blinked slowly. Billion? With a B. Yes. Jake, my nephew, held up his phone. I just Googled Goldman Sachs Managing Director. It says the average salary is. He paused, reading. Holy shit. Sorry, Grandma. But holy shit. Language, Mom said automatically, but her heart wasn't in the correction. Emma leaned back in her chair, staring at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted wings. You're telling us you work at Goldman Sachs? On Wall Street? The actual Goldman Sachs. 43 floors of 200 West Street, I confirmed, though I spend a lot of time traveling to client sites. Uncle Robert set down his wine glass carefully. Those suits are appropriate for my position, yes. And the apartment in Manhattan? Asked Cousin Patricia weakly. Company housing allowance covers most of it, but yes, it's convenient to be close to the office. Aunt Linda was shaking her head slowly. But you work at First Community Bank in Queens. We know you work there. No, I said gently. You assumed I work there because I told you I work in banking and First Community was the only bank you could think of in Queens. I've never actually told anyone where I work. Dad found his voice. But we've seen you there. Emma saw you there. I turned to my sister. Emma, where exactly did you see me? Emma's face went pale. I saw you walk out of the building. You were wearing a suit and you looked. She trailed off. I was probably leaving a meeting. Goldman has been considering acquiring First Community as part of a larger neighborhood banking strategy. I've been there several times over the past year for due diligence reviews. The information settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Due diligence reviews, Mom repeated faintly. Essentially, we evaluate whether smaller banks are worth purchasing and incorporating into larger financial networks. First Community is, well, it's exactly what Uncle Robert said. A small neighborhood bank that's struggling to compete. Uncle Robert looked like he might be sick. You're going to fire everyone who works there. We're going to optimize operations, which unfortunately often includes workforce reductions. It's not personal, it's business efficiency. My phone buzzed with another text. I glanced at it quickly. The meeting link just arrived. I should probably start reviewing the documentation. Wait, Dad said urgently. Wait, just explain this. How did we not know? I considered the question carefully. You never asked. You made assumptions based on limited information and I never corrected those assumptions. But why? Mom's voice was plaintive. Why would you let us think you were just a bank teller? Because every time I tried to discuss my actual work, you either changed the subject or explained why I was lying. It became easier to let you believe whatever you wanted to believe. Emma leaned forward. But we're your family. We would have been proud of you. I met her eyes steadily. Would you? Or would you have found new reasons to criticize me? Too ambitious, too focused on money, too good for the family? The question hung in the air unanswered. My phone started buzzing again, an actual call this time. I really do need to take this, I said, standing up. The Italian regulatory situation is time-sensitive and $8.7 billion of client money is depending on us resolving it correctly. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard Cousin Michael's voice behind me. Did she just say $8.7 billion? Director Williams, I answered the phone. Sarah, it's Marcus from legal. I wanted to brief you before the full team call. The Italians are being more demanding than we initially thought. What kind of demands? They want the subsidiary structure to include specific governance provisions that weren't in the original agreement. It's going to require renegotiation with both sides. I leaned against the kitchen counter, shifting fully into work mode. Do we have leverage for renegotiation? Some. The buyer is more motivated than the seller at this point, so we might be able to push the governance issue back onto them. But it's going to require some creative structuring. Send me the specific language they're requesting. I'll review it before the call and we can discuss options. Already in your inbox. Also, Janet wanted me to mention that the Times is planning to run a story about the merger on Sunday. They're calling it one of the largest pharmaceutical deals of the year. Let's hope we have something finalized before they publish. I'd rather not read about our failures in the business section. Marcus laughed. Understood. See you on the call in an hour. I ended the conversation and remained in the kitchen for a moment, mentally organizing my approach to the regulatory challenges. Through the doorway, I could hear my family's voices in urgent, hushed conversation. When I returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of dismissive amusement, I was met with careful attention and something that looked almost like nervousness. Everything okay with your deal? Dad asked tentatively. It will be. These things are complicated, but that's why we're paid to handle complications. Mom cleared her throat delicately. Sarah, honey, about what we said earlier. You said what you believed to be true based on the information you had, I replied calmly. No apologies necessary. But we should have asked more questions, Emma said. We should have been more supportive. I sat down and smiled at her. You were supportive of who you thought I was. That's not nothing. Uncle Robert was staring at me with obvious discomfort. Sarah, I owe you an apology. All that talk about accepting reality. You were giving advice based on what you understood about my situation. It wasn't bad advice for a bank teller. But you're not a bank teller, he said quietly. No, I'm not. Aunt Linda leaned forward. Can I ask, how much do you make? Linda. Mom scolded. It's okay, I said. Base salary is around $400,000. With bonuses and equity compensation, total annual compensation usually runs between 1.2 and 1.8 million, depending on the year. The number landed like a physical blow. Several people actually recoiled. Jake held up his phone again. I'm looking at apartments in Manhattan. For that kind of money she could afford. He scrolled through listings. Pretty much anything. The company housing allowance helps, I confirmed. Goldman takes care of its managing directors fairly well. David was shaking his head slowly. $1.8 million. In a good year. This year is looking to be above average. Because of the $8 billion deal? Asked Cousin Patricia. That's one of several major transactions. The pharmaceutical sector has been very active lately. Mom was looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. You handle billion-dollar deals? Usually several simultaneously. Currently, I'm primary on 4 deals ranging from $2.3 billion to $12.6 billion. The Meridian Castellano is in the middle range. $12 billion, Dad repeated faintly. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a calendar notification. Team conference in 45 minutes. I should probably start reviewing the documentation, I said. The regulatory changes are fairly complex. Of course, Mom said quickly. You should, yes of course. I stood up then paused. Thank you for dinner. The turkey was delicious and I enjoyed spending time with everyone. Sarah, Emma called as I started to leave. Are you upset with us? I turned back to face the table. No. You're my family and I love you. Nothing about that has changed. But we were so awful to you, Aunt Linda said. All those comments about your suits and your apartment. You were working with incomplete information. It happens. Will you? Mom hesitated. Will you still come to Christmas dinner? I smiled. I wouldn't miss it. Though I might have to take a few work calls. Of course, Dad said quickly. Whatever you need for your work. As I gathered my things, I could hear them resuming their conversation in hushed, amazed tones. Terms like managing director and billion-dollar deals floated through the doorway as I collected my coat. Before leaving, I returned to the dining room one final time. I'll probably be in the office tomorrow working on the Italian situation, but I'll call Mom on Sunday to check in. The office, Uncle Robert repeated. Goldman Sachs office. That's right. On Wall Street, he added as if confirming the reality. West Street actually. But close enough. Emma stood up suddenly and hugged me tightly. I'm proud of you, she whispered. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it. Thank you, I whispered back. That means a lot. As I drove back to Manhattan, my phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. Janet's voice filled the vehicle. Director Williams? I wanted to confirm you received the meeting materials. The team is assembled and ready to begin whenever you are. Perfect. I'll be in my apartment in 20 minutes. Give me 30 minutes to review everything and then we can start the call. Understood. Also, I took the liberty of ordering dinner for the entire team. It's going to be a long night. Good thinking. And Janet? Make sure everyone knows I appreciate them giving up their holiday evening for this. Of course, they understand how important this deal is. As I navigated through the surprisingly light Thanksgiving traffic, I reflected on the evening's events. My family's reaction had been about what I'd expected. Shock, followed by a kind of nervous recalibration of their understanding of who I was. The funny thing was nothing had really changed. I was still the same person who'd sat down to dinner 2 hours earlier. The only difference was information. Information that had always been available if they'd asked the right questions. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was already mentally shifting gears from family dynamics to regulatory compliance strategies. The doorman greeted me with his usual professionalism, and I took the elevator to the 34th floor, where my home office waited with its multiple monitors and secure network connections. I had 45 minutes to review complex legal documentation and prepare for a multi-jurisdictional conference call that would determine the fate of an $8.7 billion transaction. It was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been trained for, exactly the kind of pressure I thrived under. As I settled into my desk chair and pulled up the first document, my phone chimed with a text from Emma. Still can't believe my sister is a Goldman Sachs managing director. Mom is Googling you right now. I smiled and set the phone aside. There would be time for family adjustments later. Right now I had work to do. The Italian regulatory requirements spread across my screen in dense legal language, and I began the process of translating bureaucratic demands into actionable business solutions. This was what I did, what I was genuinely good at, turning complex problems into elegant financial structures. In 6 hours I would be on a conference call with lawyers in Rome, compliance officers in London and client representatives in 3 time zones, all working together to preserve a deal that would reshape the global pharmaceutical industry. My family was just beginning to understand that their quiet, well-dressed daughter who never talked about work was actually one of the people who moved billions of dollars around the global economy. It would take them time to adjust to that reality. But for now, I had regulatory requirements to review and a merger to save. The rest could wait until after we'd satisfied the Italian authorities and closed the deal. After all, $8.7 billion was depending on it.